Welcome. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar. And today we are touching for the very first time on a new and very important topic. Today is our first ever webinar about climate resilience. Normally our webinars are about what we can do for climate mitigation. How are we going to cut our energy use and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? This webinar and the upcoming one in a few days' time are looking instead at climate resilience. So it's acknowledging that climate change is happening and that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, and saying, how do we make ourselves stronger, both our buildings and our communities? So a sobering topic, but a really important one. I always begin with the trailers of upcoming attractions. It's coming towards the end of the year, so there's a few less on the slide now. I've got to get some dates booked for Q1 next year, so I can start telling you about those. But in terms of things that are coming up for the rest of this year, there's the second of Chris's webinars. That one's about community climate resilience. That'll be a really interesting one as well. Then we're running 2 sessions of the very popular webinar on energy saving quick wins, and I bet you can imagine why we're running those again. So there's one coming up on Monday and one a fortnight on Monday. They're both covering the same ground about how can we do quick and simple things which will reduce our energy use and our energy bills. And then also a shout out to the Caring for God's Acre autumn series. They've got 5 topics coming up, all to do with different aspects of churchyards. When I've finished the housekeeping slides and Chris has taken over, I'll find the booking links for these webinars and I'll pop them in the chat so that you can find all the details and book yourself on if you want to come. In terms of the housekeeping for today's webinar, it's our standard approach. So we'll be using the Q&A for your questions rather than the chat, please. So if you move your mouse about, find the Q&A, that's where to pop your questions. You can also see other people's questions and you can do thumbs up next to the ones you're most interested in. After the webinar, I'll send everybody who's registered a copy of Chris's slides, and I'll also send you any links that are shared in the chat. And we are recording today's session and it will be shared on our website. It always takes a few days to get it all technically sorted out and up there, but it will be on our website. Most importantly is introduce you to Chris. So I've had the absolute pleasure of working really closely with Chris over the last year. He's an embedded researcher, so he's been embedded in our team, but from the Tyndall Centre in the University of Manchester. And he's been looking specifically for us at climate resilience. What are churches already doing? What guidance do we need? What case studies can we create to help churches do more in terms of climate resilience? So if I stop sharing my slides and hand over to Chris to share his and take us away.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. So thanks for the introduction. My name's Chris, and today is the first of 2 webinars that we're going to be doing about climate resilient churches and their communities. So today is going to be a very practical session. We're going to be talking about the actions that we can take to protect our churches from what's going to be happening with climate change in the UK. And then following that, on the 25th, and I'll advertise it again, we'll start thinking about what that means for the communities around our churches as well. So just to introduce what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to start by giving you a brief introduction to some of the impacts of climate change that we're expecting to see and how they're going to impact our churches. I'm going to then move on to telling you about 3 particular churches that I've visited or looked at this year, and some of the challenges they've faced and the actions they've taken to make themselves more resilient and to adapt to the new climate challenges that they are facing. And then finally, to finish us off, I'm going to look at the actions that all of us can take within our churches to ensure that we protect them as well as we can against the impacts of climate change. When talking on this topic, it's easy to be very moribund, and indeed, for the first third of my presentation, unfortunately, it is going to be a little bit not depressing, but a little bit potentially shocking. So I would remind you that This is probably going to be one of the most pressing issues that we as a globe are face within the next century. And yes, so I'm going to briefly then, let me see, this is me. I am a researcher at the University of Manchester in the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change. We're a group of researchers who look at climate change from all kinds of angles and all around the world. I live in Manchester in Salford and go to a inner city church there with my wife and sometimes my dog Peggy. And my background is all over the map in terms of climate change. I have looked at how farmers are going to grow crops in the future. I've looked in this picture here in Malawi at how villages are already dealing with climate change and how energy projects can work to support those villages, both in terms of climate change and also in terms of poverty alleviation. And then this year, as Catherine said, I spent the year working with the Cathedrals and Church Buildings team, looking at how churches and communities can adjust to creating resilient buildings and using those buildings to create resilience for the rest of the community as well. So how have I been doing that? Well, there's kind of been two parts to this. We've been making case studies of churches all around the country that will be available on the Climate Resilient Church page hopefully by the end of this year. There'll be a link to that later on. I've attached all the links to the end that I might mention. We've been asking what churches have been doing, why they've done it, how they've done it, and we've been developing these case studies that will hopefully be helpful to you all as well. And then secondly, we're running a series of workshops which have two kind of components. They're a real educational tool. So we are educating lots of people within dioceses, within DACs, but also within church communities themselves about climate resilience and the kind of actions they can take, as well as using their knowledge and their expertise on their buildings to find out what problems are most pressing for them and how the guidance fits with them. So also at the end, I will advertise for a couple more workshops that we've still got to run, that it would be fantastic if you came and attended, and is a brilliant way if you wanted to contribute as well. So climate change, where are we? Hopefully you've seen this graph. This is from about 5 years ago, as you can see, and this is what we need to be doing in terms of our carbon emissions to affect the kind of changes we want. It's well known that at Paris, globally, we agreed to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees of warming. Now that hasn't happened. The UN has now abandoned 1.5 as a realistic target, and currently we have done little to hit that target in terms of our global emissions. So we are currently at approximately 1.2 degrees of warming. By 2050, we're expected, if we continue as we are now, to be at about 2.8 last time I checked. This is why that's important, for why resilience in particular is important. Whereas mitigation is absolutely valuable and something we need to engage in both individually and as a country and as a globe, we have already locked in a certain amount of climate change into our system. As you can see from this graph, between the high growth and moderate growth curves, there's a point of divergence between them. That point of divergence is roughly 2050. So we know that until 2050, we are likely to face the same kind of impacts regardless of our mitigation strategies. While that's scary and a little bit daunting, what that does mean is that we can realistically start to plan for those emergencies. And I think I'd just like to quickly follow up, for anyone who's a bit of a climate change nerd like I am, a little bit of what's happening in the UK. And this is in my local area in Greater Manchester. And this is just to say, even on a local level in Greater Manchester, which is one of the most vocal local authorities in dealing with climate change, there's actually been very little progress made beyond grid decarbonisation. So in Greater Manchester, we're probably looking at 2028 being the point where we run out of available carbon budget, and we start to go over that budget for 1.5 / well under 2 degrees warming. So we've got a lot ahead of us in terms of the net zero planning, but also we need to start planning in terms of what's going to happen to our churches. So the broad take homes that we have for the UK, and I'm sure many people are aware of this, climate change is going to be an all-round issue. In the summer, it's going to be hotter and much drier. I mean, we saw the results of that this summer. In Manchester, I think we reached 42. No, sorry, 38.5, 42 was in Heathrow. So we're getting those hotter summers, and also much drier. At my parents' house in Warwickshire, they experienced a huge period of drought this year. In our winters, we're looking at warmer winters and wetter winters. Throughout the year as well, we're going to be looking at more extreme weather events. So what does that mean for our church buildings? So we've got roughly 4 key impacts to churches that I'm going to talk about with you. The first of these is flooding. Flooding is going to be a problem for both urban and rural churches all around the UK, but particularly those areas which are lower and in floodplains or new floodplains for rivers and for the sea in regards to sea level rise. We've particularly got 2 kinds of flooding that we are worried about for churches. The first of these is what we would call fluvial or watercourse flooding. That's when our rivers burst our banks, which is a process that we are seeing happening more and more often in many churches, one of which in this photo we'll talk a little bit more about later. Often this in the summer is caused by those intense periods of rainfall, whereas rain will be less frequent in the summers. What we do know is that it will happen in shorter, more intense bursts. And those bursts themselves will be extra dangerous because the ground itself will be dried out. And that's the second type of flooding that we are concerned about, which is the hard surface and saturated land runoff. Particularly in urban areas, but also in some rural areas, when we have those periods of intense rainfall, our infrastructure is not yet at a sufficient level in which to deal with those changes. And we may have problems with runoff going through church buildings or through church grounds. Another big problem that is caused by flooding is that of landslips and of slumping. Persistent rain can cause saturation of water within our soil, and therefore on steep gradients we can just see the soil giving way. It's a serious issue. Rather than church buildings being affected, this is often more of an issue for church boundary walls. It's a key problem for many areas. In terms of internal flooding for churches, it can be especially damaging because of the impact on basement and crypt areas, and can result in large-scale damage very easily. The second kind of climate impact that I want to talk to you about is about water ingress, by which we mean the ways water gets into the fabric of buildings. There are a few ways that this can happen. The first and perhaps most obvious one is through the roof, caused by intense rainfall, but also by high winds forcing the water through. Walls, particularly walls that have been re-rendered about 30 to 40 years ago, have often been rendered in waterproof, non-breathable render, and that can be both internal and external. And so after periods of harsh or prolonged rain, can soak up and store the water that is available. So another thing to mention is the danger of windows and of bell towers, particularly caused by driving rain. Water ingress can cause huge problems in churches. as well as the obvious issues of damp resulting in paint peeling and sometimes structural damage, we can also see that it massively increases the chance of mold and some kinds of pest infections within the church. In terms of pests as well, this is a good point to mention that as our climate changes, we are becoming susceptible to a larger range of insects and also of bacterial infections within which can impact church fabric. You can see this for a simple example by the prevalence of mosquitoes being able to breed now in Spain, and the prevalence of mosquitoes even up where I am in the northwest this summer. Water ingress also has a massive impact on how warm our churches feel, which is particularly important when we're starting to think about our net zero targets and our comfort levels within churches. If we can keep our churches dry, it naturally doesn't feel as cold as it does when our walls and our fabrics is compromised. The third issue I want to talk about within churches is that of overheating, which may seem counterfactual to some of you. Churches we don't often think of as too hot kind of places. But the reality is that we are going to be seeing churches, particularly through southeast and west facing windows, causing thermal discomfort and overheating through very, very quickly through sunlight. While this might be through isolated areas of the church that are particularly bad, we will be seeing our churches heating up significantly. I don't know if anyone else remembers how the heat wave felt after 3 days if they opened their church up for people. But actually, the churches started to heat up themselves as well. Slowly, sure, and less quickly than the houses, but that may well be a present issue for some churches. The second problem for heat is in windows, particularly in stained glass windows, which may be vulnerable at temperatures over 35 degrees to cracking. Where there are small blemishes or small parts of damage to stained glass windows, they are particularly susceptible to stress through heat, in which they expand and then when it becomes cold again retract. That can result in cracking and destruction that we would love to avoid. This photo here is from Canterbury Cathedral when they were putting on a protective screen to minimize the risks of overheating within their windows. The last thing I want to mention with overheating is actually an issue that impacts the land itself. Subsidence and drought-related subsidence is a growing issue in the UK. Indeed, I've seen churches in the UK that have overnight had huge cracks increasing in them due to their being on clay-based soils. While this can be emphasised by large trees or drains that may erode subsoil, it's actually just going to be a really big problem for most buildings built on clay soils. Particularly those like churches, which can often have different kinds of foundations for different parts of the buildings, and is going to be one of the more expensive problems that needs to be kept an eye on. The final and perhaps most obvious impact that we see in our churches is that of extreme weather. And when I say extreme weather, I mean wind, storm events, hail and snow. We expect to see not just more extreme weather events, but also weather events of a higher magnitude. That means events that impact us more. No doubt we will all be familiar with with Storm Arwen that happened at the start of this year, and some of the scenes we saw of churches with their roofs ripped off or even towers coming down because of wind. But the other impact of extreme weather is to emphasize the difficulties that the church buildings are already having with the other factors of climate change. So that means with water ingress, pushing rain and water through the walls into the interior, or creating more damage in roofs and windows that will allow for rain seepage into the buildings. It also means in cold weather, water that's already present within the building fabric, completely normally, will freeze and expand, causing huge damage to fabric, particularly to stone and woodwork. It may also cause warping within woodwork within churches. So I hope that's okay that we've now gone through those. I understand that it can be a little bit shocking to think about our churches in regards to this kind of weather impacts and climate impacts that we're going to have. So thankfully, we're moving on now to the good news about what churches are doing and what you can already do about it. But what would be really helpful for me and what I'd be really interested to see is what impacts are you already having within your church right now. Catherine is going to launch a poll for me. And what I want to hear from you is just that one, whatever risks in particular you're feeling. Put down a load down there, but also feel free to add others to the chat that we may not have mentioned. And I'll come back to that at the end of my section on the 3 churches to have a little look at what we've said.
Just worth mentioning as you fill in the poll that on my laptop, at least, there are some options down the bottom that you need to scroll down to see. You've got to the end of the list when you get to the one that says other, and it's multiple choice, so you can click as many as are relevant to you and your church.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine.
The answers are starting to come in. We'll give it a couple of minutes for people to vote. We're up to 25 people so far.
Well, I'll start talking about some of the churches we've seen, and then we'll come back to the poll results. So the first...
I'm sorry, I would hang on, Chris, because the box sits in the middle of the screen, so they won't be able to see your slides properly. Right. You have a drink of your tea whilst we let another few people vote, and then we'll see where we get to. That's 50.
We've got one
in 50 people voting.
One in the chat as well, saying about trees falling, given closeness to buildings. Very absolutely.
That is 78% of people have voted. I'll give it another just few seconds for people who are thinking hard about which ones work for them. Right, I think I will end the poll there and share the results for everybody.
Ah, brilliant. There we go. Interesting. So render stonework tower damage is coming out top. That's interesting. I think, well, perhaps I'm wrong, but for me, that feels like that might be one of the ones that this is climate change kind of impacting things we're already having difficulties with and making them worse. Too cold in winter, absolutely one that I think lots of us are feeling coming up now. Access routes, absolutely. I didn't really mention access routes, also high. Brilliant. Thank you so much for doing that. Let's have a look at what some churches have already done. So the first church I want to talk to you about is St Michael and All Angels in Turley. You've seen this before, and I'm sure you may well have seen on the news. This is from 2007, where they had their worst floods in over a century. Turley sits in the Severn Basin, so floods aren't uncommon in that area. However, what we're seeing now is floods at a level and a frequency that is well above previous years. In 2007, then, they had a massive flood that came and impacted the church hugely. As you can see, the church grounds and the church itself, interior, was completely flooded. This caused huge amounts of damage, as I'm sure you can imagine, and took a period of, I think it was 5 years to fix and replan with the church. Additionally to the water problem, water was seeping in through the flagstones into the graves that were there, and there were things coming up through the floor. You can also see in this photo a particular brown sort of stain around the church from silage nearby and farm systems nearby. So all fabrics in the church were effectively destroyed, as well as a huge amount of the interior. So what did the church do about that? Well, actually, Turley is a real story of a church bouncing back and being a real pioneer for a lot of the methods that we've seen within the church. And I would encourage you to go and look at the case studies for all of these. But perhaps if you're a church that is at risk of flooding, particularly have a look at Turley. As well as redesigning the interior of the church and taking that opportunity to develop a really flexible, usable space for what the community needed. They were also invested in a number of different innovations with sump pumps, one-way valves in the walls of the churchyard. They installed a balcony level to the church to which all valuable fabrics can be moved in the event of a flood coming. And they also trained a number of members of the community to be first responders for flooding, to come to the church and be able to set up the pump that pumps water straight back out of the church again, set up the flood defences on the doors and openings. They also did some really practical steps of moving all the electrical sockets up to 1.5 metres and making a lot of their church items out of wood and non-perishable fabrics. So as well as protecting the church, which has, by the way, subsequently flooded or been protected from flooding a number of times, they created new uses for their church building and new people to come and see what they had done. The redesign was designed particularly around the concept of flooding and resilience to flooding and the biblical metaphors that come from that. And that's resulted in a lot larger foot traffic through the building, but also actually strengthened the community's involvement in the building as they can see that that building is for them and in some ways as a memorial and a remembrance of some of the devastation that was caused. To something completely different scale. This is St Mary's and Peter's in Wennington in Greater London. This is from this summer where they had a wildfire. Wildfires aren't something that I ever really thought of as a particularly UK-based thing. But unfortunately, that's what is starting to happen while they're still dealing with a lot of the practical implications of the fire from summer, including with the community, lots of whose homes fared a lot worse than the church. They're also starting to come up with practical solutions to protect the church building. As you can see, the church building itself was relatively untouched by the fire. That's largely because the churchyard was maintained with a relatively low grass. If grass had been high, if there had been more shrubs, they may well have been in real difficulty with their church building as well. Their big problem came from, as you can see on the top right, their area of Cleveland, in which they were composting leaves and they had more shrub cover and high grass. And so for them, their future is about planning how their church can be resilient to those fires and the steps that they can take to protect that church. So as I say, practical steps to stop reoccurrence. It's also about engaging with the community and creating that community resilience, which is something we'll talk about in previous, and also facing up to a new reality that wildfires may well be impacting the UK as well and their area of the UK. And particularly for them, it's about looking and reviewing those maintenance routines. Are they storing compost in a way that is safe for the church in a hot summer month and in a drought period? Do they need to move those things away from the church building during droughts? How do they manage the grassland and the glebe land outside of their church as well? The third church then I want to speak about is another completely different thing, and that's St Marylebone Parish Church in London. They have undertaken a huge project of renovation and refurbishment of their roof in particular, and the inside of their roof building, which has been a huge project there. But I want to talk about one bit of it very particularly, which is about their drains. They were able, with their architect team, to use climate predictions for rainfall for London, which meant they over doubled their drainage capacity and put in new leading, widened the top of gutters, and created that as a real focal point for what they were doing with the building. They really centered climate change and the future of that building within their renewal plans for it, right from the beginning, both using language about climate change and creating a space, a resilient space, but also integrating that kind of aspect within their community. That was something that the community really appreciated. So that's 3 quick examples of churches that are doing something about climate change and impact, how it impacts their church. Just to give you a brief idea, so we had one that was really on that protective aspect about the worst kind of impacts. We had one which is looking at its maintenance regimes and the small kind of actions it can take to minimize its risk. And we have a third who've within already taking place works have looked at integrating climate change and embedding climate resilience within their future plans. And those are 3 of the really important steps that we have tried to include in our new guidance that we're going to be releasing for churches on climate resilience. So for the third part of my talk, we're going to just talk about that guidance itself and what we can do practically as church members, as DAC members, as diocesan workers, or as clergy, whatever we are, what we can practically do to ensure that our church buildings remain in use and remain usable for the next 30 years at least. So yes, so as I said, we know that climate change is already impacting our churches in the Church of England, and we know it will get worse. But we can and we are already managing a lot of those changes. So we have a 5-step process that we are asking churches to consider doing. None of these steps are mind-blowingly technical or require a degree in climatology, but they are really practical things that actually we can do now and we can integrate into how we work in churches that will have big impacts. The first one of those illustrates that point completely, which is just having a really good maintenance regime. When we've talked about issues of damp ingress, when we've talked about issues of extreme weather, knowing where the areas are that could potentially let in water, so your roofs, your doors and your windows, checking those and ensuring they are in good standard is really important. Cleaning your gutters. I've talked to QI architects who always say every year they come back and they say, you just need to clean your gutters. It's a really important step that has a massive impact on the level of a damp ingress into our buildings. And the third one is being aware of your building, checking out those little bits of the building behind the organ. I know in the church I grew up with, there was a window behind the organ that you had to squeeze through a small gap to look at, ensuring that you're able to see those gaps and those regular areas, checking your slates on your roof, all those kind of things that, although small, have a real impact, particularly on the building's heating envelope, which will have other benefits in terms of keeping your church warmer throughout the winter, which, I mean, as we could see in that poll, was a massive issue. Second thing we wanted to do is start to identify risks to your churches. There are lots of different ways to do this. The first one being local knowledge. In Turley, one of the churches I talked about earlier, people who had lived there knew where rivers would flood. They knew where those floods would come from, and they knew how long that would roughly give them to get in the church and change it. But as well as that local knowledge of historical weather and extreme events that are happening to our church buildings and to our communities, knowledge of other risk factors can sometimes be harder to access. So at the end of this presentation, and also within the guidance, I've embedded a few links that will be available for you. But some of these could be like your local authority's climate impact profile. So Greater Manchester writes a report, and I think it's every couple of years, about what the biggest risks are for homes and buildings within Manchester. This picture is of the National Trust's climate hazards map, which has all kinds of things from extreme weather, where it's predicted to get worse, where flood events are meant to get worse and where landslips are becoming more common. Also, gov.uk has flood risk. The Climate Centre, Crisis Centre has information on sea level rise. There's all kinds of tools available and easily accessible through both the Climate Resilient Church webpage, but also through a Google search that will give you more kind of info to what you need to do for what risks your church might particularly be at in terms of climate change. The third is about planning. And this is one of the things we're going to be introducing, which is our Climate Resilience Action Plan. Beautifully there, modelled by a colleague, but here is the same plan filled in with one example church. And what we're going to be asking churches to do, and whether that be PCCs or clergy members, is to think about what risks churches might be facing. So that's using those tools, that local knowledge, what the kind of impact level you're expecting and how likely those are to happen. To think about actions that might limit the impacts of those climate risks, which could come from the case studies, could come from brainstorming, could come from your DAC. Think about the actions that you can take and that you are taking and that you may need to future taking, and then to review that at a later date. Particularly the questions we want you to ask are: what harm this risk might pose to our church and community, what action we take, who then is responsible for that action, and when does it need to happen? Is it a one-off or is it a regular task, and who do we need to make aware of that? So as I say, we're going to be releasing a template for this work that for you to share and to use, hopefully, that will be helpful for people to start to visualize the kind of impacts that will happen. Our fourth step is to communicate. It's important that not just this information isn't just kept within the church, as well as the missional aspect of this that we'll talk about. Actually, for many communities, the church remains to be a valuable community asset that people are really invested in protecting. And those are the kind of people that we need to communicate with about those plans, as well as communicating about the risks that we may know about that they may not be aware of. As this is going to be an ongoing problem to 2050 and beyond, we need to ensure that there's a legacy and a continuing and ongoing process of risk assessment and risk management. So it's best to bring in the community as a whole, but also to communicate with local authorities, with emergency services, and those who may be important in how you manage those risks. And 5, the final point is to review this. I mentioned this briefly, but actually thinking about how your location is changing is really important. Additionally, as time goes forward, there'll be more projections. These will be updated. Organisations like Historic England or Historic Environment Scotland are constantly updating their guidance. This is an area of research within universities and within government that is vastly evolving very, very quickly. So there's lots of new information coming out of it and being made aware and being made available in really accessible ways, thankfully. Secondly, it's worth thinking about what changes in your environment. When we change the environment that our church is in, we might change what some of the risk factors are. Someone mentioned there trees, so potentially if tree planting may be something, thinking about where you're planting trees and previous trees planting, whether they may be a risk under high winds. Increased tarmacking could reduce the capability of drainage. New housing developments in the area might shift floodplains. And increasingly, as rivers evolve and change, floodplains themselves might shift as well. So we recommend looking at these resilience action plans regularly. I would say annually, but as often as reasonably possible, I think is true. And through those 5, I think, relatively achievable steps, we can actually do quite a lot to protect our church buildings and to be aware of those issues that are coming so we can plan them in. So if you're making changes to your building, you can build in climate resilience and thinking about how you reduce your risk, whether it be drainage or whether it be planning for additional access in ice conditions. So that's the third part of my presentation. I hope you found it interesting, and looking forward to seeing any questions you might have for me in the Q&A. But a brief plug for when I'm going to be popping up again. On the 25th at lunchtime, I'm going to be talking about people. So it is my belief and strong held belief that climate change is incredibly missional within our communities, and our church's mission will have to evolve to include climate resilience, both for the building but also for the communities that it's within. So on the 25th, I'm going to be talking about resilience hubs. So come along, I'll tell you what resilience hubs are and how we put them in our church, and then how we can help our communities. Another brief plug, if you would like to come down to any of my workshops that I'm running, if you're in any of these areas, you would be extremely welcome and indeed encouraged to come along and join in the conversation. So we're running one on the 17th in Blackburn, one on the 22nd in London with Southwark Diocese, one in Newcastle on the 28th, and one in Manchester, where I am, on the 30th of November. Those are my links I'll send out, but I'll leave this workshop page up, if that's all right, Catherine, and I can move on to answering some of your questions.
All right, just catching up with you because I was putting those links in the chat. I've put the links to all 4 of your workshops and the other useful links that you had there into the chat. And when I send Chris's slides out to everybody, I'll include all of the links from the chat. So don't feel you have to attempt to write them all down now, because they will come out by email from me. So if you want to take your sharing down now, Chris, and we'll have a look. So the first is a comment really, rather than a question, but it is so sobering. I think it is worth reading out, which was from Margaret, just saying by 2050 our coastal town is set to be under seawater according to modelling. I think that just reinforces the importance of everything you've been talking about today.
Absolutely.
So for everyone joining today, if you've got a question using the Q&A rather than chat, please do find the Q&A and have a look in there, and we will just start working our way through all the questions there until we get to 5 o'clock. So the first question is from Hannah, and it touches on point 4 of your 5-point plan, which is saying, how can we carefully and sensitively talk to churches about the need to take these actions without scaring them about the reality of worsening climate change for the next 30 years. The comms piece feels really important. You probably don't have all of the answer to that, Chris. That's a big question. But from what you've been hearing as you've gone around and talked to church communities, how do we approach that communications piece?
I think the first thing to say is generally people are quite aware of this already. I mean, lots of people just recently watched David Attenborough's Frozen Planet, which almost half of it, I would say at least, was directly about the impacts of climate change. And it is scary and it is really hard. I think we have a responsibility in the church to be honest about it. And I think through that honesty comes the kind of trust that you are actively confronting these problems and actively thinking about them. And I think that's really important, because I think while climate change as a whole is scary, and there's no doubt about that, the reality is that we can individually and cooperatively change what's happening. And so I'd say, in terms of sensitivity, I think it's best to be honest. Absolutely. I don't think sugarcoating this helps. I think that just leads to troubles down the way. I think be honest, but also be realistic that this isn't unfixable. And that's really, really important. There are a lot of people and a lot of work already going in to making sure that these problems won't be as bad as they could be. And there's lots of people who are much cleverer than I am working on that right now. So serious, treatable.
Yeah. And once people could start planning now, but once your guidance has come out, which won't be very long now, will it? Then they've got practical guidance there with a template action plan that they can use to sit down and talk about as
And
church.
hopefully, as you've seen, like, these steps aren't big. They are very, it's very achievable to do an awful lot of this work. And even just maintaining a really good maintenance regime in itself makes a humongous difference.
The next most popular question is about funding. That says from Chris, is there any funding available from within the Church of England to help deal with some of these problems, or must churches fund the remediation themselves? So let me find you two things, Chris, one of which is through to our church care grants. Now, these are only relevant in certain circumstances because the church care grants pay for conservation. So if you have historic fabric within your church, which is either already being damaged by weather events or which is at threat of being damaged by weather events and climate change, I suggest you have a look at the conservation grants. But of course, that's only relevant where it's that kind of historic fabric. The other thing, whilst it's not a fund, it's not that there's a fund to apply to, but it's information about how to find it, is a link through to our environmental fundraising page. And on there are links through to directories of funders who are you can approach for environmental funding. They're all competitive. There is no quick and simple answer. They're all competitive. And the other side of it is that a lot of what Chris is pointing towards is that good maintenance. Good maintenance is in many ways can be the hardest thing to fundraise for, but equally it's probably something that you already have on your radar as something that you do need to fundraise for as a church. So it's not that it's new activity. Anything you would add to that, Chris?
I would just add as well, if you are doing these, if you've already got funding to do things, please just think about this as a part of that process. And so perhaps if there are DAC advisors listening as well, think about those future projections. If you are reordering a church, consider what might be coming and build that into that project, so you can kind of do two birds with one stone. Particularly thinking about things where, like guttering, if you're replacing your guttering, maybe don't immediately go for like. Think about whether you might need to increase it.
And I'll also just pop in the chat a link through to the National Churches Trust grants. They, in particular, their foundation grants, could be very useful in this context. So, Chris, no easy answers, but hopefully some helpful pointers there. The next question is from Ian that says, couldn't we incorporate this into our quinquennial inspection regimes? To which the answer is it already is, I believe. Chris?
Yeah.
Is that one for me?
I think it's one for you. I think it broadly, some of these things are included in your quinquennial. I think using the data and the points from your quinquennial are really, really important. As I mentioned, there's a lot of stuff in QIs about maintenance and about looking at the little problems. So that can be a really great place to populate. If you're writing a risk assessment, populating it through your quinquennial is absolutely the way to go. But I think there is a need to make these issues known more than just in the quinquennial, if that makes sense. So outside in the wider church community, I think it's important that the whole church knows about what you're thinking about in terms of resilience.
I'll just show, so this is the quinquennial, the national framework for what should be covered by a quinquennial inspection report. And whilst it's not, it is in there. I mean, you could say it's a dot point at the end of many dot points, but the survey carried out by your quinquennial inspector will cover all of these things, and it includes the risk of impact of a changing climate, of flood risk, rainwater goods and stonework. So it is in there, and you should be expecting to see that from your QI report if your diocese's QI framework follows the national guidance, which is what I'm showing you there. Right. The next question is from Hannah again. Is the National Church going to be doing any work on supporting dioceses on climate hazard mapping, or will it be up to us here locally? So those dioceses that have asked you for a workshop, which I know we've got those links up there, does that include climate hazard mapping for the diocese?
No, not really. We talked a little bit about very specific things for dioceses. I think, well, I don't speak out of turn with this really. I think in terms of individual churches, there are resources available that can quite easily show you what you're most at risk at. And I think on a diocesan level, you can look at those too and look at your areas that's already been done, I would say. And I particularly point you to those links, which are the National Trust one in particular is really, really helpful for that sort of thing. But also the flood mapping. There's, I can't remember which one I put in. Did I put in? Yeah, so the rainfall mapping from the UKCP is pretty high resolution. So yes, so I think ideally churches themselves would be able to look at this sort of stuff. But I think a lot of the difficulty is just knowing where to look, which hopefully this should help you with.
Yeah. And Hannah, I'm wishing my data colleague was here today, James Miles. I'm sure that he has got all of the DEFRA flood maps, and he has mapped them against all of our church codes to find out what risk all of our churches are on the flood risk register. I thought that information had gone out to every diocese, but given I know that you work for the Oxford Diocese team, if you haven't seen it, maybe it hasn't gone out to every diocese. So I'll take away an action to check that and let you know. Another question from Hannah. Hannah's got a lot of questions today. Do we need to start thinking about managing decline? Ooh. I know the National Trust plan this into some of their properties, i.e. there's no point putting money into this property because it will still fall off an eroding cliff. Do we need to be honest about doing this with churches? Well, I think that might be a question, a slightly philosophical question beyond Chris and I.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that that's something that each DAC is looking at. If it knows that it's got, for example, if there's a church really close to the coast and it's eroding, I'm sure the DACs are well aware of that, and archdeacons would be well aware of that and discussing it pastorally with the communities affected. I'm not sure I've got anything wiser to say on that, Hannah. Elizabeth's question: How up to speed are dioceses with climate change and making it easier to obtain faculties for work to improve churches' resilience? So you have been going to all of the DAC regional meetings, haven't you, Chris?
Yeah, so I have now talked to pretty much every diocese in the country about climate resilience and kind of given them some training on that. Apart from, I can't remember which region it was where I had COVID, but there was one I didn't, so apologies to that region. But aside from that, we have talked about that a lot. So and through the workshops, we are trying to build the knowledge, the amount of knowledge that there is within the church on climate resilience. And without tooting our own horn too much, I would say it's at a far higher level than it is in most other kind of heritage organisations. This is really still quite early in the climate resilience heritage conversation, which is, I mean, a brilliant thing within the Church of England that we're already thinking about this and already doing stuff about this, because that's not what's happening everywhere.
Next question says, insurance costs, restrictions on listed buildings to change for resilience. How can we cope with costs and restrictions as well as declining congregations and therefore income?
I assume that might be saying about if churches are more at risk, are their insurance premiums going to go up potentially? Or is it more about insurance? Because I mean, I've heard stories of sometimes insurance being an issue in terms of needing to replace like for like. talking to an ecclesiastical, certainly this year, that hasn't been the case in terms of drainage anymore. They would rather you replaced with larger rainfall drains. So I don't know if that answers your question, Julie. I hope that's vaguely
my
helpful.
sense from, I mean, it's hard to tell from the wording, but I suspect that's more of a cry from the heart than a specific question about insurance. That it can feel like another challenge on an overloaded parish. Question from Sophie: is there any way to limit or reduce the high costs of getting a faculty for any works, e.g., especially when additional costs are required for chancellor involvement? The charges, I mean, faculty fees are not to do with climate resilience. That's outside of the scope of this webinar, I think. I'll take away the point and I'll speak to my colleagues about it and see if there's anything wise. I don't think I can answer that one today, Sophie, because I think faculty fees are outside of this. If a church is considering a reordering program, for example, adding a toilet and kitchenette, how can it incorporate climate resilience in its plans?
That is a fantastic question. And partly I would say, come along on the 25th. But I think actively thinking about climate resilience as a missional part of what your church is going to be doing is really, really important. Not just in we should because this is God's world and God's people and we want to protect it, but also in terms of working with local authorities, being able to respond to climate events as well within your communities. Slight spoilers, but I think churches can really fulfill a role as a climate resilience hub for their communities, where that building can become a really important part. So it's thinking about how those facilities would fit with big climate events. So when that webinar comes around, we might talk about churches, for instance, that everywhere around them floods, and that church suddenly needs to provide a warm and dry place for people. So it's thinking about how you can use those facilities in a way that you can provide them to your wider community as well. Is particularly true. Also thinking potentially about the size of rooms that you're creating in terms of heating might be an important one. Just off the top of my head.
I would say as well, if you're at the point of planning a toilet or a kitchenette or something like that, and you know that your church is at risk of flooding, then have that conversation really early on with whoever is designing it for you, because there might be practical things they can do about routing the electrics higher off the ground, or having, you know, kickboards underneath kitchen units on legs that keep the actual units off the ground, so it's easy to remove and replace the kickboards. So it's just practically, if you're in the middle of a project and you know you're liable to flooding, have that conversation and build that in right from the beginning, as one of your objectives of the project is to ensure that it is resilient in the event of flood. How are we doing? 2 minutes left and 3 things open. Let's see if we can do them at speed. Can you explain a little bit more about the resilience template? Will it be mandatory? Will it come with guidance, etc.? So when your guidance comes out, that's going to be best practice, isn't it? It's not going to be a mandatory requirement. And what will it cover briefly?
Hopefully it covers all kinds of things, from the little maintenance jobs that you need to be keeping on top of, whether that be clearing out your drains. Sorry to keep going on about drains, but whether you clean out your drains, or the bigger things about thinking about what my community going to do in a heating crisis.
Question from Richard: where parishes and groups have several churches, should they think hard about which are best to maintain and decide to mothball others? I think that kind of strategic deanery review or benefice review is always a good thing to be doing for all sorts of reasons, of which climate resilience is only one. Decisions about open to close are absolutely local decisions that need to be taken at that kind of level, and I'm sure that climate resilience might be one factor that plays into that, but there will be many. And finally, Robin from Redruth, Cornwall: presumably inland Cornwall, wind and driving rain are the main issues. Have you looked at all at the data specifically for Cornwall? I
literally just looked it up. Yes, Cornwall is winds and driving rain are among them, increased storm events, but also drought is going to be really a real issue in Cornwall. They don't, irrigation infrastructure isn't particularly great.
I'm noticing that Claire has popped in the chat a really useful looking link through to Ecclesiastical's flood advice. Thank you very much for that, Claire. And I'm conscious that some of the comments earlier were about trees. So I've just put in there links through the Church of England tree maintenance guidance and the Caring for God's Acre page. I know that's a lot of links that have come in there. Don't worry, I'm about to send them all to you along with Chris's slides. Chris, thank you so much. You bring a very strategic but also a very practical and sort of grounded view on the subject, which I'm sure everyone has really appreciated. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who has joined us today to listen in. Please do come along for the second topic, where Chris is going to be giving similar examples, but about how churches have supported their communities through times of extreme weather rather than the building itself. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. And I'll send you Chris's slides and those links, and the link to the recording will be on our website in a few days' time. Thank you all, and I will just bring us to a close. Goodbye.